Anyone who is a fan of Aaron Sorkin or a fan of Danny Boyle is going to love this movie. It's really first-class entertainment, but it's important to point out that this is not the history of Apple. This is not a biography of Steve Jobs. Steve was a very complex personality, and this is just one aspect of his personality, but just for sheer acting, screenplay, directing, it's terrific. What I loved about it is that I can recognize Steve in the character, even though there's a lot of creative license taken in terms of what actually happened when and where. I can tell you, because I knew the young Steve Jobs so well. We were very, very close friends. Sure, he was intense, and sure, he was a passionate perfectionist. But the Steve Jobs I knew was someone who had a great sense of humor. He actually really cared about the people he worked with. He cared about making a difference in people's lives. He was fun to hang out with. And you could kind of set aside and excuse his demanding style from time to time because he really was a very good person. I think the movie was actually correct in the things that happened. They just didn't always happen in the order in which they were shown in the movie. There was creative license taken because it made for better entertainment, a better story. But the basic themes, the representations of who the personalities were, Joanna Hoffman, myself, Steve Jobs, Woz, I think that our personalities were captured pretty well. In the movie, I was played by Jeff Daniels, one of the truly great actors, and I was thrilled to have someone that talented play my part. I think that what he was attempting to do is to have me come across as the older brother, the guy from the East Coast who was kind of counterbalancing the young, brilliant, genius, visionary Steve Jobs. Steve was the intense one, I was the more pragmatic one, and yet people don't realize that the young Steve Jobs was quite different than people's idea of what the mature Steve Jobs, clearly the world's greatest CEO, but the young Steve Jobs was still discovering what it was like to be a leader. He was making mistakes like all of us make mistakes as we're learning. And so the young Steve Jobs was a work in progress. All of us have to grow, and Steve, I think, grew a lot in those years that he was away from Apple until he came back 15 years later. I think Steve would see a lot of things about this film that he would like. First of all, it's a perfectionist product. Everything about it, the acting, the directing, the screenplay, it's terrific. I mean, it's as well done as entertainment ever gets done for the movies. And Steve is a perfectionist. Second of all, Steve is a very authentic person. So I think Steve Jobs would never be one to try to make this different than what it really was. But I also think that Steve Jobs would be a little bit hurt because many people who never knew the young Steve Jobs could go away from seeing this movie and think, well, I know Steve Jobs. Well, guess what? You don't. Steve was a much bigger, more complete person than just what you see in the 2-hour movie.